I want you to start by trying to conjure up a very specific and honestly a pretty terrifying physical sensation.
Right.
Imagine you're flying, but you need to immediately wipe away basically any modern conception of what that word means.
Right. No pressurized cabins here.
Exactly. You are not sitting in a comfortable, climate-controlled tube sipping a tepid cup of coffee while watching a movie. You are miles above a literal raging battlefield,
Jeez.
sitting on a tiny wicker seat inside a machine that is, for all intents and purposes, a motorized kite.
Yeah, that's really the best way to describe it.
It's constructed entirely of ash wood, piano wire, and tightly stretched linen fabric. That's it. That is the only thing between you and a 10,000-foot drop.
Just wood and cloth.
And the wind is howling in your face so loudly that it is physically deafening. Like you couldn't hear yourself scream if you tried. You're completely exposed to the freezing cold in an open cockpit. And this is the kicker, you do not have a parachute.
No.
Oh, and if you want to communicate with the people on the ground, the people whose lives depend on the information you're gathering.
You have to operate a massive, incredibly fragile, 75-pound piece of early radio equipment that is quite literally crammed into the passenger seat right next to you.
Welcome to the birth of modern air warfare.
It is, it's a genuinely staggering mental image to put yourself in that wicker seat. The sheer sensory overload of that environment is really hard to overstate.
I can't even imagine.
You've got the deafening roar of a rotary engine spewing raw castor oil straight back into your face, freezing temperatures numbing your extremities,
Yeah.
and the constant omnipresent threat of the entire contraption just shaking itself apart midair.
Right.
And yet, for the individuals we're exploring in this deep dive, that wasn't an imagination exercise, you know? It wasn't a hypothetical stress test. That was a Tuesday.
Just a normal workday.
It was their daily, unvarnished reality. What we're doing today is looking really closely at the complete historical life cycle of the Royal Flying Corps, the RFC, which served as the air arm of the British Army from 1912 until 1918.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to pull apart a transformation that I just find completely mind-boggling based on the sources we have.
Oh, absolutely.
We're charting the journey of how a tiny, incredibly experimental unit, a group initially dismissed by the military establishment as basically just flying chauffeurs.
Which is such a great term.
How they rapidly mutated into the massive, globally reaching, industrialized powerhouse that is the Royal Air Force. And they did it in just 6 years.
6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
When you think about that incredibly compressed time frame, it's not just a story about airplanes. It is a story about how entirely new domains of human conflict are invented from absolute scratch.
Right.
And how a technology goes from this dangerous novelty to the absolute center of global strategy in the blink of an eye.
I think the reason this specific 6-year window is so vital for you to understand today is that it really serves as the ultimate historical case study in rapid, almost uncontrollable technological innovation.
Yeah.
If you want to understand the brutal realities of a startup culture, that ethos of moving fast, breaking things, iterating on the fly, you have to look at the RFC. Except in this startup, the failure state wasn't losing venture capital. It was falling out of the sky.
Yeah, the stakes were just a little bit higher.
Just a bit. This is a masterclass in how human beings adapt, both psychologically and structurally, to operating in entirely unprecedented, highly lethal environments. They were quite literally building the airplane while flying it.
I really love that framing. A militarized startup.
Yeah.
To really grasp the scale of the growth, we have to ground ourselves in the origins, back in that pre-war era around 1912 to 1914.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about the absolute bare-bones inception of this organization. The Royal Flying Corps was established by a royal warrant on April 13, 1912, under King George V, and the original vision was actually for it to be a joint service. It was supposed to combine a military wing for the Army and a naval wing for the Navy, operating under one umbrella.
Which sounds great on paper.
It does. But as with almost any joint military venture where budgets and prestige are on the line, the Navy took one look at the setup, decided they wanted ultimate control over their own toys, and very quickly split off to form the Royal Naval Air Service.
Which is a classic bureaucratic move.
Totally.
And that schism left the military wing, which became the core of the RFC, starting with almost nothing. When we talk about a startup in a garage, this was literally a startup in a muddy field.
Right.
On day one, the entire air power of the British Army consisted of exactly 133 officers, 12 manned observation balloons, and just 36 aeroplanes.
36.
That was the entirety of their aerial capability. 36 fragile, highly unreliable machines for the entire British Empire.
It's wild.
Yet despite those meager beginnings, they adopted a motto that remains incredibly famous, one that the Royal Air Force and various Commonwealth Air Forces still use today. Per ardua ad astra.
Through adversity to the stars.
Through adversity to the stars.
Adversity feels like the understatement of the century here. When you look at how they initially tried to organize this tiny group of aviators, the hierarchy is just wild to me. It's completely backwards to how anyone today understands aviation.
It's a perfect illustration of how large, established institutions like the British Army struggled to map their traditional thinking onto an entirely new paradigm.
Right.
They were trying to force a two-dimensional cavalry mindset into a three-dimensional battle space. In the early days of the RFC, the officer sitting in the aircraft looking down at the ground was the person in command of the mission and the aircraft.
The guy with the binoculars.
Exactly. The pilot, the person actually keeping the machine from plummeting into the earth, was treated merely as a chauffeur.
Which is insane.
They were viewed as the driver, a technical operator whose only job was to cart the important officer up to a high vantage point so he could look around.
Wait, really? So the guy holding the steering column, wrestling with the wind, isn't in charge?
Not at all.
That explains so much about the early military disdain for pilots. They were just viewed as a new type of driver.
Yeah.
But the danger of simply operating these machines, even without an enemy shooting at you, was astronomically high. Let's walk through the very first fatal crash of the RFC to get a sense of the culture.
It's a dark one.
This happened on July 5, 1912, near Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain. Captain Eustace Lorraine and his observer, Staff Sergeant R.H.V. Wilson, were flying when their aircraft went down, killing them both.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, a fatal crash in a brand new experimental unit is a massive crisis.
Yeah.
How did the military brass handle this?
The official response to that first tragic loss is deeply telling about the institutional mindset.
Yeah.
They didn't ground the fleet to conduct a massive safety review.
Yeah.
They didn't hold a long period of mourning. The military command issued an order later that same day that stated, in its entirety, flying will continue this evening as usual.
That is chilling. Just a completely cold, pragmatic machine moving forward. Flying will continue.
It is chilling, but it was also a deliberate psychological tactic. It immediately established a stoic, almost fatalistic culture within the early RFC. The underlying message was clear. Death is now a standardized part of this operation. The mission supersedes the individual. Get back in the cockpit.
Wow.
And they had to adopt that mindset because they were dealing with absolute unknowns every single time the wheels left the grass.
Give me an example.
Well, consider the aerodynamic concept of an airplane spin. Today, understanding how a plane stalls and enters a spin and knowing exactly how to push the controls to recover from it is basic private pilot training. It's taught early on.
Right.
In 1912, a spin was an absolute, undisputed death sentence. Nobody knew the physics of what was happening, and nobody knew how to get out of it.
Because if your plane starts spinning toward the ground, every human instinct tells you to pull back on the stick to try and go up.
Exactly.
But pulling back in a stall just makes the spin worse, right? It tightens the rotation.
That's it. The counterintuitive physics of flight just hadn't been codified yet. Until August 1912, when Lieutenant Wilfred Park was flying a biplane and accidentally entered a spin at 700 feet.
700 feet is not a lot of room to figure things out.
No, it's really not. We have accounts of this. He was plummeting toward the earth, his instinctive inputs weren't working, and so purely by trial and error, and undoubtedly driven by sheer unadulterated panic in what he thought were his final seconds, he pushed the controls in the opposite direction.
And it worked.
He recovered the aircraft. It was the very first time a spin recovery had ever been observed and documented.
Which is an incredible moment of aeronautical discovery. He basically solved the most lethal puzzle in early aviation right before hitting the ground.
He did. But the dark coda to that story is that Lieutenant Park died just 4 months later in a completely different crash.
Oh, man.
It perfectly highlights the omnipresent peril. You could solve one deadly puzzle, but the machine itself was still so experimental, so prone to structural failure or engine death, that simply trying to fly was an extreme hazard.
So we have this tiny group of fatalistic pilots flying incredibly fragile, dangerous machines in peacetime. How on earth did they transition from these deadly little experiments into a vital, functional tool of global war?
That's the big pivot.
Let's move the timeline to the outbreak of World War I. This brings us to the period of 1914 to 1915, a phase I can only describe as a completely DIY war.
Yeah, that's accurate.
It's a period where every single innovation was born entirely out of desperate necessity.
When war was declared in August 1914, the RFC deployed to France to support the British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF. Remember that starting number of 36 planes?
Yeah.
By the time they deployed, they managed to scrape together a bit more, but they only sent 60 machines over to France.
Let me stop you there to just underline that. 60 planes to cover an entire massive European front, tracking millions of troops. That is nothing.
It's a drop in the ocean.
Yeah.
And yet, those 60 incredibly primitive planes proved their strategic worth almost immediately.
How so?
On August 25th, 1914, Captain Charlton and Lieutenant Wadham were in the air, puttering along at maybe 60 miles an hour, when they spotted the German First Army executing a massive, sweeping flanking movement.
So they see the whole German army moving.
The Germans were trying to encircle the British. Charlton and Wadham landed, reported this intelligence, and that single piece of aerial reconnaissance allowed the BEF commander to realign his front and retreat in good order, effectively saving the entire British army around the town of Mons from being wiped out.
That is the ultimate proof of concept. One flight basically saves an army.
It justified the existence of the entire RFC in one afternoon. Suddenly, the generals on the ground realized they needed these flying chauffeurs.
Right.
But as the military inevitably began demanding more heel, expanding the aircraft's roles from simple visual observation to wireless telegraphy to complex photo reconnaissance to aerial bombardment, they slammed headfirst into incredible friction.
Because the planes just couldn't do it.
The rudimentary technology of 1914 was simply not capable of handling the demands being placed on it.
I think my favorite example of this friction and the sheer absurdity of early aviation is the weight issue.
Oh, yeah.
The engines on these early planes were so pitifully weak, and the planes themselves were so underpowered that when the commander started asking pilots to fly further distances to scout behind enemy lines, they had a major problem.
A huge problem.
They needed more fuel, but if they added more fuel, the plane literally couldn't take off. So what did they do? To save weight, they just left the observers behind.
Which is a brilliant example of a hardware limitation forcing a catastrophic tactical decision. Let's think about the pilot's workload here.
Okay.
You're flying an open cockpit biplane that requires 2 hands and 2 feet of constant physical exertion just to keep it level. There is no autopilot.
Right.
Now, remove the navigator. You, the pilot, are flying completely alone, often in terrible weather or low cloud cover, over unfamiliar French and Belgian countryside.
And trying to read a paper map while the wind is trying to rip it out of your hands?
Exactly. The inevitable result was that pilots simply got lost. You have these high-stakes, critical reconnaissance missions completely failing because the aircraft's engine couldn't generate enough horsepower to lift 2 grown men and a full tank of gas.
Mm-hmm.
The technology was dictating the limits of strategy.
But the flip side of those technological limits is how the pilots reacted to them. The weaponization of these planes is absolutely fascinating because it was so profoundly improvised.
Very much.
It was chaotic. I mean, there were no built-in bomb bays on a 1914 biplane. The aeronautical engineers back in England hadn't thought that far ahead. They were just trying to get the things to fly.
Just keeping them airborne was the goal.
The innovation of aerial warfare came entirely from the bottom up. It was driven by the 20-year-old pilots in the field who were flying over German troop columns and realizing, hey, I have the ultimate high ground here. I should probably be dropping something on them.
The ingenuity born of frustration.
Yeah.
You have incredible historical accounts from this period. For instance, there's Lieutenant Conran.
Oh, this guy.
He would fly low over an enemy troop column, take his hands off the controls for a split second, literally pull the pins on infantry hand grenades with his teeth or his free hand, and just toss them over the side of his wicker cockpit.
It's just wild to picture.
He wasn't aiming for massive structural damage. He was dropping them to stampede the German cavalry horses and cause chaos on the roads.
I just picture him leaning over the edge of a flying canvas tent, shucking grenades.
Yeah.
Or what about Captain Louis Strange? This guy took DIY warfare to another level.
Louis Strange is a legend of early aviation. He wasn't satisfied with hand grenades. He started fabricating his own homemade petrol bombs.
Like Molotov cocktails.
Exactly. He would rig these incendiary devices, fly over enemy lines, and manually drop them onto canvas-covered German supply trucks to set them on fire. It is pure, unregulated improvisation.
But that wild improvisation is exactly how formalized systems begin, right?
Right.
Because Strange's homemade firebombs proved effective, the military apparatus eventually caught up. They went from a guy tossing a petrol bomb by hand to actually modifying the wings of the planes to carry specialized 20-pound Cooper bombs on metal racks.
And the pilot would release them by yanking a wire cable routed into the cockpit.
The pipeline from chaotic field experiment to standardized military hardware was incredibly short.
They were willing to try absolutely anything, regardless of how absurd or dangerous it seemed on paper. A perfect illustration of this is a bizarre, highly classified mission they attempted in September 1915.
Let's hear it.
They decided they were going to use an airplane to covertly drop an espionage agent, a spy behind German lines.
Which sounds like something out of a James Bond movie, except they're trying to do it in a rattling wooden box.
Keep in mind, this had never been attempted before in the history of warfare, and it failed spectacularly.
Of course it did.
The insertion didn't work. The aircraft ended up crashing behind enemy lines. Both the pilot and the spy were badly injured in the wreck, and the German forces immediately captured both of them.
So a total disaster.
Total.
Although there is a wild postscript to that story. The pilot who was captured actually managed to escape a German prisoner of war camp 2 years later and make it back to Britain.
Which is an amazing story on its own.
But you're right, it speaks volumes about their appetite for risk. But while certain pilots were trying to drop spies or leaning over the side of their planes throwing grenades, there was a much more sophisticated, though admittedly clunky, technological revolution happening.
Yes.
A system of communication was being developed that would fundamentally change how the war on the ground was fought.
And that transition is critical, because tossing a few 20-pound bombs is a nuisance to the enemy, but it doesn't win a war. What changes the course of a battle is information. As the Western Front locked into static trench warfare, the primary, absolute, most critical roles of the RFC solidified into two highly technical disciplines: artillery observation and photo reconnaissance.
Let's dive into that. This brings us to what we can call the data war, spanning roughly 1915 to 1916. This is the era of cameras, giant radios, and a deeply fascinating psychological phenomenon called optimism bias.
It's a great era to study.
But first, let's look at the problem they were trying to solve. In trench warfare, you have massive artillery guns situated miles behind your own front lines. They're firing at German targets that the gunners cannot visually see.
Right.
They're firing blind over hills and forests. They desperately needed eyes in the sky to tell them, hey, your massive, highly explosive artillery shell landed 500 yards to the left of the enemy bunker.
To solve the visual side of that equation, the RFC introduced the more Brabazon semi-automatic camera.
Now, we use the term semi-automatic very loosely compared to today's standards, right?
Oh, absolutely. This was a heavy, cumbersome piece of equipment bolted to the outside of the fuselage. The pilot or observer had to manually pull a lever to change the heavy glass photographic plates after every single exposure.
Imagine doing that at 16,000 feet.
It's rough.
The air is incredibly thin, you're hypoxic, your fingers are completely numb from the sub-zero freezing temperatures, and you are trying to swap out fragile glass plates while someone on the ground is shooting anti-aircraft flak at you.
It was grueling physical labor, but the results were revolutionary. Those sharp glass plate photos could capture a massive 2-by-3 mile grid of the front line in incredible detail.
Wow.
By mid-1915, these aerial photographs became the exclusive source material used by cartographers to compile the highly detailed 1 to 10,000 scale maps that the entire British Army relied on.
So they were making the maps from the sky?
To put the strategic value into perspective, the entire massive Somme offensive in 1916, involving millions of men, was planned using maps derived entirely from RFC aerial photography. They were mapping the battlefield in near real time.
Okay, so the photography solves the map problem. But taking a photo, flying back, landing, developing the glass plate, and handing it to a general takes hours.
Right.
If you want to direct live artillery fire in real time, you need radio communication. And this is where the technology gets beautifully absurd. To communicate with the artillery batteries, they developed the Sterling lightweight wireless transmitter.
I always laugh at the military designation of lightweight here.
Right. Lightweight meaning it weighed 75 pounds.
Yeah.
It was a massive wooden and brass box that literally took up the entire observer's seat in the cockpit.
It was a behemoth, But if a pilot could manage to get this massive weight into the air, it unlocked a brilliant piece of operational engineering known as the zone call procedure.
How did that work?
They divided the maps into alphanumeric grids. An RSC pilot would fly over the lines, spot a high-value target, say a concealed enemy artillery battery that was hammering British troops, and he would use a physical Morse code telegraph key strapped to his leg or the dashboard to tap out the target's specific grid location. That signal was beamed directly back to a British artillery battery.
So the pilot taps out the grid, the British artillery miles away receives the Morse code, and they fire a shell.
Right.
But it doesn't end there. Then the pilot has to circle around, watch where that massive shell actually explodes on the ground, and report the fall of shot.
Exactly. They used a clock code. So he'd tap out something indicating the shell landed at 3 o'clock, 200 yards from the target, allowing the artillery to adjust their dials and fire again until they hit it.
It's an incredibly tight, effective data loop, except for one glaring, almost comical technological bottleneck.
The 75-pound Sterling radio was a transmitter only.
It was completely incapable of receiving messages.
The communication was strictly one way from the plane to the ground.
Which begs the obvious question, how on earth does the artillery battery tell the pilot, hey, we received your Morse code, we're adjusting our aim, stand by to observe the next shot?
This is where you see the collision of high-tech and absolute low-tech. To reply to the pilot, ground crews attached to the artillery batteries had to run out into an open field and physically lay out massive strips of white canvas cloth in specific geometric patterns on the mud.
Unbelievable.
The pilot, thousands of feet in the air, peering over the side of his cockpit through binoculars, had to read these giant cloth symbols to know what the artillery was doing.
It is so wildly inefficient.
Very.
You have wireless radio waves bouncing through the ether going one way and guys playing giant arts and crafts in the mud going the other way.
It was clumsy, but it was revolutionary for 1915. However, the introduction of this data loop highlights an incredibly important and timeless issue regarding the human element within complex technological systems.
And this is the optimism bias.
Right. Observing artillery fire from above amidst clouds, smoke, and enemy fire requires intense, specialized training. But because of high casualties, many RFC pilots were rushed to the front inexperienced. And this leads to a phenomenon explicitly detailed in the historical records known as optimism bias.
This is such a profound psychological insight. Walk me through exactly what optimism bias looked like for an RFC pilot.
Put yourself in the pilot's shoes. You're under immense stress. Anti-aircraft fire, Archie, as they called it, is boosting black clouds of shrapnel all around you.
Terrifying.
You are desperately trying to be helpful to the men dying in the trenches below you. You want the mission to be a success. You tap out your coordinates, the artillery fires, and an explosion goes off somewhere near the target.
Okay.
Inexperienced pilots, driven by a psychological need to deliver good news and validate their own perilous effort, would frequently and falsely report over the Morse key that the artillery rounds were hitting the target dead on, when in reality they were missing by hundreds of yards.
Their brains literally tricked them into seeing what they desperately wanted to see.
Precisely. It's misinterpreting raw data in a high-stakes environment because human optimism overrode objective analysis.
Wow.
It meant British artillery was wasting thousands of shells, pulverizing empty mud, because the data feed from the sky was being corrupted by human psychology.
That is fascinating. And while we're talking of the data loop, we have to spare a thought for the men on the receiving end of those Morse code signals.
We really do.
The pilots had it rough, but the sources paint a horrific picture of the ground-based RFC wireless operators.
It was an absolute nightmare assignment. We have accounts of men like Henry Tabor, who served as a wireless operator.
Yeah.
These men weren't safely back at an airfield. They were stationed in makeshift, rat-infested dugouts right next to the heavy artillery batteries on the front line.
Right.
And because those British batteries were firing constantly, they were the prime targets for German counter-battery artillery fire.
So they're sitting in a hole in the ground trying to listen to a faint Morse code ticking sound in their headphones, while thousands of pounds of high explosives are literally raining down on their heads.
Yes.
And to make matters worse, these operators were administratively orphaned. They belonged to the flying squadrons miles to the rear, but were detached to the army, so they were basically abandoned.
They had to scrounge for their own food, fight to get their pay, all while doing this incredibly technical job.
And their equipment was fragile.
The antennas required to pick up the signals from the planes were constantly being blown to pieces by German shells.
Right.
So in the middle of a massive artillery barrage, operators like Tabor would have to scramble out of their deep dugouts, run through a landscape of exploding mud and shrapnel, splice a broken copper wire together with freezing hands, and dive back into the hole just to keep the data flowing.
It was a massive decentralized data processing operation conducted under the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
And it scaled up rapidly.
By 1918, the RFC employed over 3,000 personnel whose entire job was just to sit in rooms behind the lines and interpret the aerial photographs brought back by the planes. 3,000 people just processing visual data.
But here is the grim reality of being that successful at intelligence gathering.
What's that?
Because the RFC became so vital to the ground war, their slow, heavy observation planes became the absolute highest priority targets for the German military.
Makes sense.
The Germans realized that if they blinded the cameras and silenced the radios, the British artillery became useless. They had to sweep the RFC from the sky.
And that strategic imperative leads directly to the invention of fighter planes, armed escorts, the romanticized but horrific reality of dogfights, and a truly staggering human cost.
It changes everything.
Let's move into Section 4, a period covering 1916 to 1917, which is dominated by a month so horrific it earned the title Bloody April. It's the era where the sky turned into an absolute meat grinder.
This period marks a fundamental doctrinal shift. We move from aviation as primarily an observation tool to aggressive aerial combat and direct ground attack.
And the driving force behind this radical shift was the commander of the RFC in France, Major-General Hugh Trenchard.
Trenchard is a massive figure in aviation history, but his philosophy was, and remains, incredibly controversial.
Trenchard was a visionary, but he was ruthless. His entire military doctrine was built on one uncompromising pillar: relentless offensive action.
He believed with absolute certainty that the RFC must constantly take the fight to the enemy. They couldn't just patrol their own side of the trenches.
No.
They had to operate deeply over German lines, constantly attacking, to force the German Air Force onto the defensive and pin them back.
But his logic went beyond just shooting down enemy planes or bombing railways, right? He was heavily focused on the psychology of the infantryman.
That's the key to Trenchard. He prioritized the morale effect above almost everything else. He knew that for a British soldier sitting in a muddy, terrifying trench, seeing a friendly airplane overhead provided a massive psychological boost.
Yeah, you feel like someone has your back.
Conversely, he believed the sheer terror an aircraft instilled in German ground troops, the constant threat from above, was just as strategically valuable as the physical damage the bombs caused. The psychological dominance was the goal.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what does Trenchard's doctrine of relentless offense mean for a 19-year-old pilot sitting in a squadron?
It's grim.
It means they were ordered into the air constantly, aggressively, regardless of the weather, regardless of fatigue, and most importantly, regardless of the tactical odds.
Right.
And in early 1917, those odds turned terribly, terribly against the British.
The technological pendulum of war swung hard. The German Air Service recognized the threat and fundamentally reorganized.
How did they do that?
They grouped their best fighter pilots into specialized hunting squadrons called the Jastas. And more importantly, they equipped these Jastas with technologically superior aircraft, most notably the Albatros series of fighters.
What made the German Albatros so vastly superior to what the British were flying at that moment?
It was a combination of speed, structural strength, and firepower. The Albatros was streamlined, it had a powerful inline engine, and crucially, it was armed with twin, synchronized machine guns that fired straight through the propeller arc.
Well,
Many of the British planes, conversely, were still slower pusher types, where the propeller was behind the pilot, or older biplanes that simply couldn't climb as fast or dive as steeply without their wings ripping off.
So they were outclassed.
Completely. So when these outclassed British observation planes and early fighters met the highly organized, technically superior German Jastas during the buildup to the Battle of Arras in early 1917, a slaughter ensued.
This became known in RFC history as Bloody April.
Yes.
The numbers from Bloody April are just sickening. The life expectancy of a new pilot arriving at a squadron on the Western Front during this period plummeted to a matter of weeks.
Or days.
In some squadrons, a new replacement was statistically likely to be dead or shot down within days of arriving.
And the casualties weren't just from high-altitude dogfights with the Red Baron.
Right.
Trenchard's relentless aggression meant ordering pilots to conduct direct ground attack missions.
Which means
This meant taking a fragile, fabric-covered biplane, loading it with those 20-pound Cooper bombs, and flying at incredibly low altitude, sometimes 50 or 100 feet off the ground, to directly strafe enemy trenches and drop explosives on troop concentration.
Oh, which strips away all the romantic mythology of knights of the sky dueling in the clouds.
Exactly.
If you're flying at 50 feet over a trench containing 1,000 angry infantrymen, you aren't being shot at by specialized anti-aircraft guns. You are being shot at by ordinary guys with bolt-action rifles.
Basic infantry small arms fire from the mud was shredding these aircraft. A single rifle bullet hitting a fuel line or the pilot meant certain death at that altitude.
Wow.
Because of this, the casualty rate for squadrons tasked with ground attack missions approached an unimaginable 30%. You go out with 10 planes, only 7 come back, day after day.
The sheer industrialized scale of the danger is incredibly hard to wrap your head around today. We aren't talking about a dozen guys. By the end of the Somme offensive in November 1916, the RFC had lost 800 aircraft. And in the following year, the meat grinder year of 1917 alone, 2,094 RFC aircrew were officially listed as killed in action or missing.
Over 2,000 young men wiped out in a 12-month span.
It was a brutal, uncompromising rate of attrition. They were feeding young men into a machine just to maintain Trenchard's offensive posture.
They really were.
But here is the twist that absolutely floored me when I was reviewing the history for this deep dive.
What's that?
The German fighter pilots, the anti-aircraft flak, the infantry rifles, all of those things combined weren't the only major killers of RFC pilots.
Right.
In fact, they might not even have been the biggest danger. Learning how to fly the airplane in the first place was almost as lethal as taking it into combat. We have to examine Section 5, the training crisis, and the parachute paradox.
The statistics regarding training from this era are truly horrifying, and they speak to a monumental systemic failure.
Give us the numbers.
By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, approximately 8,000 men in the British flying services had died in training or routine flying accidents.
Let me just pause on that number. 8,000 men.
8,000.
8,000 young guys who volunteered to fight, who kissed their families goodbye, and who were killed in crashes in quiet fields in England or Scotland before they ever saw a single German trench. How does a military apparatus allow that to happen?
It happened because, in the desperate rush to feed pilots into the meat grinder of the Western Front, early training was practically non-existent. It was dangerously brief and methodologically flawed.
How brief?
The historical records state that observers, the men handling the radios and cameras, were frequently sent up on their very first combat sortie over enemy lines with nothing more than a brief, verbal introduction to the aircraft yelled at them by the pilot over the noise of the engine.
Here's the done. Don't shoot the tail off. Good luck.
Quite literally. And the training for the pilots themselves wasn't much better. A cadet might receive maybe 10 to 20 hours of primary flight instruction before being deemed qualified and set up to fly solo in a high-performance, unforgiving machine.
And the scariest part of that 10 hours of instruction is the hardware they were using.
Oh, yeah.
I learned that many of the early training airplanes didn't even have dual controls.
It's true.
So you have an instructor sitting in one seat and the terrified 18-year-old student sitting in the other, but the controls are only linked to the student. If the student panics, freezes up, or puts the plane into a fatal dive, the instructor couldn't just grab a secondary stick and wrestle the plane back to level flight.
They just crashed together.
It was pedagogical madness.
The fatality rate in the training squadrons was a dark joke among the cadets. It wasn't until a man named Colonel Robert Smith Barry, who was absolutely appalled by the senseless slaughter of trainees, took command and revolutionized the process.
He formulated a comprehensive, standardized curriculum at Gosport, which became known as the Gosport system.
Right.
Wait, what did the Gosport system actually change?
Everything. First, he mandated the use of aircraft with fully functioning dual controls for instruction. The instructor could override the student at any moment.
That seems like a no-brainer.
You'd think. Second, and most importantly, he changed the philosophy of training. Instead of just teaching a student how to keep the plane level in calm air, the Gosport system forced students to intentionally put the aircraft into highly dangerous maneuvers, like stalls and spins, with the instructor right there.
So they learned how to crash, basically.
They practiced entering and recovering from the deadliest situations in a controlled environment so that when it happened accidentally, they had the muscle memory to survive.
That's brilliant.
Implementing this system alone effectively halved the training fatality rate almost overnight.
It's amazing what happens when you actually teach someone how to survive the machine.
Really is.
But the training fatalities, as horrific as they are only one part of the tragedy here. We have to talk about parachutes.
Oh, the parachutes.
This is the part of the history that just makes my blood boil because it is so fundamentally avoidable.
The parachute controversy is a stark, enraging example of institutional coldness and archaic military dogma overriding basic human logic.
To be clear, the technology existed, right? Parachutes were not science fiction.
No, not at all. Inventors, most notably a man named Everard Calthrop, had developed and were actively offering patented functional parachutes to the RFC as early as 1915.
Okay, so maybe the military thought they were unreliable.
No, they knew they worked. In 1917, to prove the viability of the technology, a New Zealander serving in the RFC, Captain Clive Collett, successfully demonstrated a parachute jump from a military airplane moving at speed, safely descending from 600 feet.
And it worked.
The demonstration was flawless.
So the technology exists. The military has seen a live demonstration that proves it safely brings a man to the ground. Thousands of their highly trained, expensive pilots are currently burning to death in the sky or jumping from flaming planes to their deaths. Do they order the parachutes and put them in the planes? No, they do not. Why?
Let's unpack the exact mindset of the military brass, specifically the Air Board, because it is a fascinating, if morbid, study in organizational psychology. Now, it's important to note they did issue parachutes to one specific group.
Oh.
The men sitting in the observation balloons.
Right, because an observation balloon is basically a giant stationary target filled with highly flammable hydrogen gas. The German fighters would specifically target them with incendiary bullets. The lifespan of a balloon observer during an offensive was measured in days.
Exactly. When the balloon caught fire, the observer strapped on a parachute and jumped. The military accepted that because a balloon can't be saved or maneuvered.
Makes sense.
But the Air Board deliberately, explicitly issued orders denying parachutes to airplane pilots.
Because they were worried that if a pilot had a parachute, it would somehow sap his courage. They literally thought it would make them cowards.
That was the core of the argument. The official documented fear of the senior commanders was that if a pilot was equipped with a parachute and his aircraft was damaged in combat or suffered an engine failure, he might be tempted to prematurely abandon an expensive piece of military hardware rather than fighting to the very end to glide it back to friendly lines.
They prioritized the wood and the canvas over the pilot's life.
They absolutely did. They dressed it up in Victorian ideals of fighting spirit and defensive zeal.
That's infuriating.
There were secondary excuses, of course. They argued that early parachutes were bulky and added weight, which degraded the plane's climbing performance. But the foundational issue was an antiquated, almost aristocratic belief that a true warrior stays with his mount, even if that mount is on fire.
It is just a bitter, bitter irony.
Yeah.
And the epilogue to that specific tragedy is that reality finally forced their hand.
Yes.
The sources point out that official orders were finally issued to equip all single-seat fighter planes with parachutes. But that order was issued on September 16, 1918.
Which, if you know your history, was less than 2 months before the armistice was signed in November. The war was effectively over.
It arrived far, far too late.
Far too late to save the vast majority of the thousands of pilots who perished needlessly in disintegrating aircraft.
It's heartbreaking. It really is. But pulling back from the individual tragedies, we have to look at the macro picture. Despite these massive internal doctrinal failures, despite the horrifying casualty rates, and despite the technological friction, the organization itself was succeeding at its primary mission.
It was.
And because it was succeeding, it was ballooning in size at an exponential rate. They were recruiting tens of thousands of men from all over the world, which forced a complete structural reimagining of how an air force operates.
This takes us to our final act, scaling up, going global, and the birth of the RAF from 1917 to 1918.
Let's get into it.
We talked earlier about the militarized startup concept. Well, this is the phase where the startup goes public and becomes a multinational conglomerate. The logistical expansion of the RFC is breathtaking.
Tell me about it.
You start in 1912 with a few guys in a tent with 36 planes. By 1917, the organizational chart had exploded. Squadrons, which were groups of a dozen or so planes, were grouped together to form wings. Wings were then grouped together to form massive brigades.
And the physical infrastructure required to support that many aircraft completely transformed the landscape of Britain and France.
Completely.
They weren't operating out of grassy paddocks anymore. They established these sprawling industrialized stations. To house the planes, they erected dozens of massive Bessonneau canvas hangars, these huge semi-permanent wood and canvas structures.
To give you a sense of the scale, let's look at one specific station mentioned in the historical data, Narborough Airfield in Norfolk.
Okay.
Narborough wasn't a field, it was a self-sustaining aviation city. It grew to encompass 908 acres of land.
900 acres.
It featured 7 massive hangars, incredibly complex motorized transport garages to maintain the fleet of trucks, dedicated engineering workshops, sprawling coal yards for heating and power, and barracks for thousands of men.
And this incredible infrastructure expansion wasn't limited to the UK and France. The RFC literally went global to solve its insatiable appetite for trained pilots and operational reach.
They had to.
They realized they couldn't train enough pilots in the cloudy, cramped skies over England, so they established massive training bases internationally. They went to Canada and built facilities like Camp Borden, which trained thousands of Canadian and American volunteers.
They set up training schools in the sunny, clear skies of Egypt.
They even went to the United States. During the brutal winter of 1917 to 1918, the RFC actually set up a massive complex called Camp Taliaferro in Texas to take advantage of the flying weather and to train alongside the newly formed American Air Service.
Which, sadly, just exported the hazard of flight to a new continent.
Yeah, 39 RFC members actually died in training accidents just in the skies over Texas.
And for a tragedy.
But operationally, they were expanding too. RFC squadrons were deployed to fight in Italy. They were bombing targets in the Middle East and flying reconnaissance in the Balkans. It became a truly global force.
But the sheer scale and complexity of managing this massive, global, highly technical force led directly to a monumental political crisis back in London.
Between the Army and Navy.
Exactly.
Okay.
The RFC belonged to the Army. The Royal Naval Air Service belonged to the Navy, and they were viciously competing against each other for the same limited supply of aircraft engines, spruce wood, and factory production lines.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was a toxic procurement rivalry that was actively hurting the war effort. This crisis led to one of the most important documents in military aviation history.
The Smuts Report.
Yes. In August 1917, a South African general named Jan Smuts presented a comprehensive report to the War Council.
Smuts was a visionary.
He really was. He looked past the tactical mud of the trenches. He recognized the ultimate, terrifying potential of air power. He foresaw a future where aircraft wouldn't just support armies, they would fly right over the armies to unleash strategic devastation upon enemy industrial centers, cities, and civilian populations on a vast scale.
And he knew you needed a dedicated force for that.
Smuts argued that to unlock this strategic bombing potential and to permanently end the toxic infighting between the Army and the Navy, a radical step had to be taken.
And his recommendation was a total break from the past. He said you have to take the airplanes away from the Army generals and take them away from the Navy admirals and create a completely new, unified, independent air service.
An institution that stood on equal footing with the traditional branches of the military.
And the British government agreed.
They did. And so the endpoint of this massive 6-year sprint arrives. On April 1st, 1918, the Royal Flying Corps officially merged with the Royal Naval Air Service.
Wow.
On that day, the RFC ceased to exist, and the Royal Air Force, the RAF, was born. It was the world's first Air Force independent of Army or Navy control.
And the scale of this new organization, the RAF, compared to where they started, is the punchline of this entire deep dive.
It really is.
By 1919, just after the war ended, the RAF comprised an astonishing 114,000 personnel and over 4,000 top-tier combat aircraft.
Let's just hold those two data points next to each other. April 1912, 133 officers and 36 frail planes.
Yeah.
April 1918, 114,000 personnel and 4,000 highly lethal warplanes. It is an industrial miracle.
Unbelievable.
And they achieved that final transformation while fighting the desperate climax of a global war. In April 1918, during a massive final German offensive designed to win the war before the Americans fully arrived, the newly formed RAF was thrown into the breach.
What happened?
They flew unceasingly to halt the advancing German infantry. On April 12 alone, they flew more missions, dropped more bombs, and fired more ammunition than on any other single day in the entire 4-year war.
And the cost of holding that line was astronomical. They lost over 1,000 aircraft to enemy action and accidents in that short period.
It was the ultimate industrial-scale meat grinder.
But they held the line. The German offensive stalled, largely because the RAF destroyed their logistical supply lines from the air.
They proved General Smuts right. Air power was now a decisive, independent factor in victory.
It's a completely different universe from where they started. And before we wrap up, I think the cultural footprint this crucible left behind is fascinating, too.
Oh, absolutely.
When you look at the young men who survived the RFC, you find individuals who went on to shape the 20th century in completely unexpected ways. You have veterans like W.E. Johns, who took his experiences and wrote the incredibly famous Biggles Aviation adventure books that inspired generations of pilots.
Yeah, those are classic.
Yeah.
You also find Jack Cohen, who survived the war and used his demobilization money to found a little market stall that eventually became the massive Tesco supermarket empire.
Tesco. I didn't know that.
You even have William Stevenson, a decorated RFC fighter ace who later played a foundational role in intelligence during World War II, helping to form the organization that would eventually become the CIA.
The extreme pressure of the RFC forged people who learned how to operate in chaos, how to innovate rapidly, and they carried those skills into the post-war world.
They really did.
So, to bring this entire massive deep dive together for you listening, think about the sheer trajectory of the 6-year journey we just unpacked. We started with a handful of guys in riding booths acting as glorified flying chauffeurs, trying to figure out how to recover from a spin, literally throwing hand grenades out of wooden biplanes just to scare horses.
Right.
6 years later, that same organization is conducting synchronized, massive-scale aerial warfare across multiple continents. They are using specialized glass plate photography to map battlefields, wireless radios to direct heavy artillery, and they are managing a logistical supply chain of over 100,000 people.
It is a profound, almost terrifying testament to human ingenuity. It shows our incredible resilience in the face of horrifying attrition, and quite frankly, it shows the terrible, accelerating catalyst for technological growth that is total war.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword of innovation. And I want to leave you with a conceptual thought to mull over as we conclude today, building on something we spent a lot of time discussing earlier.
The optimism bias.
Exactly. Consider the concept of optimism bias that afflicted those early RFC pilots. We talked about how these young men, sitting in an entirely novel, highly complex technological environment under immense psychological stress, routinely reported what they wanted to see regarding those artillery strikes, rather than the objective reality of what was actually happening on the ground.
They wanted the system to work so badly that their brains altered the data.
Yeah, the deep human desire for the new tech to just be a silver bullet that solves the terrifying problem.
Precisely. And as we look at our own world today, as we rapidly adopt new, highly complex and somewhat opaque technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence algorithms making legal or medical decisions, or autonomous systems driving our cars and flying our modern drones, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question.
What's that?
How much of our own inherent optimism bias is currently being built into our feedback loops? Are we, much like those early RFC pilots leaning out of a vibrating canvas cockpit over the Somme, so incredibly eager for our new technology to work perfectly, to be the silver bullet, that we risk misinterpreting or ignoring the actual reality of the failures on the ground?
That's a great point.
A fundamental question of human nature interacting with rapid, poorly understood innovation. And clearly, looking at the history of the RFC, it is a psychological challenge we've been grappling with for over a century.
Wow. That is a fantastic and deeply unsettling point to end on. A century later, and we are still fighting our own blind optimism when we build new machines. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the dawn of aviation. Keep questioning the technological systems around you. Keep exploring history for those hidden, very human lessons. And as the pilots of the RFC would tell you, keep looking up.